My life was a sequence of controlled environments. The precise temperature of my apartment, maintained at a steady 71 degrees. The curated quiet, broken only by the click of my mouse and the low hum of my computer. The geometric order of the books on my shelves, arranged by spine color into a gradient that pleased my eye and soothed some anxious corner of my soul. I was a freelance graphic designer, a job that suited my temperament perfectly. It allowed me to create order from chaos, to build beautiful, logical systems on a screen, all from the safety of my meticulously arranged fourth-floor walk-up. Loneliness was a familiar tenant, one who paid his rent on time and never made a mess. I had, over the years, mistaken his quiet companionship for peace. Then, the apartment across the hall, for B, which had been vacant for 3 silent months, was sold. The first sign of change was noise, a jarring, unwelcome intrusion. The scrape of heavy furniture against the floorboards, the muffled thuds of boxes, the deep, resonant timbre of a voice I did not recognize. For 2 days, I kept my door bolted and my curiosity chained. I worked with headphones on, trying to drown out the disruption to my carefully constructed world. But on the 3rd day, as I was retrieving a package from my doorstep, the door to 4B swung open. A man emerged, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty hand. He was the source of the voice and the disruption. He was tall, with shoulders that seemed to take up the entire width of the doorway. His hair was the color of dark coffee, thick and unruly, with a few stray wood shavings clinging to the ends like stubborn bits of confetti. He wore a simple gray t-shirt that was dark with sweat across his chest and back, and worn jeans that hung low on his hips. He wasn't classically handsome in the way of magazine covers, but there was a solidity to him, a rootedness that felt elemental. His eyes, when they landed on me, were a startling shade of green, like moss after a rain. They took me in for a moment, a quick, assessing glance that made me feel suddenly flimsy, like a preliminary sketch next to a finished oil painting. He gave me a short, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and headed down the stairs, his work boots making heavy, solid sounds on the worn treads. I stood there for a full minute, my package growing heavy in my hands, my heart thumping a strange, unfamiliar rhythm against my ribs. My first impression wasn't a thought, not really. It was a feeling, a low, vibrating hum of awareness that started in my chest and spread outward. He was real, in a way that felt loud and overwhelming to my quiet, digital existence. His name, I learned from the small, neatly printed label on his new mailbox, was Alex. The days that followed settled into a new kind of routine. My quiet was now punctuated by the sounds of his life. The low thrum of a power sander, the sharp rap of a hammer, the occasional curse, low and gravelly, followed by a moment of silence. I never saw him bring in furniture. I only ever saw him bring in raw planks of wood and tools. I deduced he was some sort of craftsman, a carpenter or a furniture maker. The idea fit him. He seemed like a man who made things with his hands, who shaped the world into something solid and useful. I became an observer, a voyeur of the mundane. I learned the sound of his footsteps in the hall, a steady, unhurried tread that was entirely different from the frantic scuttling of old Mr. Henderson in 3A. I learned that he left early in the mornings, the scent of fresh coffee and sawdust trailing faintly in the hallway, and returned late in the afternoons, smelling of varnish and sweat. I'd find myself lingering by my peephole, waiting for the sound of his key in the lock, just to catch a glimpse of his broad back as he disappeared inside. It was a pathetic, secret little ritual, and I hated myself for it, but I couldn't seem to stop. He was a disruption, a vibrant splash of color in my monochrome life, and I found myself inexplicably drawn to the chaos he represented. My internal monologue, usually a placid stream of project deadlines and grocery lists, became a frantic analysis of his every perceived action. A nod in the hallway wasn't just a nod. It was a sign of acknowledgement, a flicker of connection. Or was it just politeness? A dismissal? I'd spend an hour dissecting the slight upturn of his lips. Was it the beginning of a smile? Or a grimace? I was turning into a detective of micro-expressions, and my only suspect was the man across the hall who likely didn't know I existed beyond being a name on a mailbox opposite his. The first touch was accidental. Entirely, utterly accidental. I was heading out to grab the mail, pulling my door closed just as he was locking his. We both reached for the bank of mailboxes at the same time, our hands converging on the small brass knobs. The back of his hand brushed against mine. His skin was warm and calloused, a startling contrast to my own, which was perpetually cool and smooth from hours spent on a keyboard. The contact lasted for less than a second, a fleeting spark of warmth and texture. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. "Sorry," he muttered, his voice a low rumble. He didn't look at me, focusing instead on unlocking his mailbox. "No, my fault," I squeaked, my own voice sounding foreign and high-pitched. My heart hammered against my ribs. I fumbled with my key, my fingers suddenly clumsy and useless. The spot on my hand where he'd touched me tingled, a phantom sensation that I could feel long after I had retreated back into the sterile safety of my apartment. I leaned against the door, my mail scattered on the floor at my feet, and took a deep, shaky breath. I am losing my mind. This is what isolation does. It turns a simple, accidental touch into a cinematic event. I spent the rest of the afternoon replaying the moment in my head, analyzing the rough texture of his skin, the low timbre of his apology, the way he had immediately looked away. It was a meaningless interaction, a standard, awkward hallway encounter between neighbors. But for me, it was a data point, a piece of evidence in a case I was building entirely in my own head, the conclusion of which I was too afraid to even consider. A few days later, I saw him struggling with a long, heavy slab of dark wood on the landing. It was at least 8 feet long and looked impossibly heavy. He had it balanced on one shoulder, his body contorted as he tried to maneuver it around the tight corner of the stairwell. His bicep was bunched, veins standing out in sharp relief, and a line of sweat trickled down his temple. For a moment, I just watched from the crack in my doorway, my usual passive observation. But something in his grunt of frustration, in the sheer, brute force effort of the task, pushed me into action. It was a strange, unfamiliar impulse. "Do you need a hand with that?" The words were out of my mouth before I could stop them. He turned his head, his green eyes finding me in the dim light of the hallway. He looked surprised to see me, to hear my voice. "I'm all right," he said, his voice strained. "Just a tight corner." "It looks heavy," I insisted, stepping out into the hall and letting my door click shut behind me. The sound seemed to seal my fate. No turning back now. He hesitated, then gave a small, resigned sigh. "Yeah, it's a bit of a beast. If you could just grab the end and guide it, keep it from scraping the wall." I moved to the other end of the plank. The wood was cool and smooth beneath my palms, sanded to a near-perfect finish. It smelled rich and earthy, like a forest floor. "Okay," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Ready. On 3, he grunted. 1, 2, 3. We lifted together. My end felt surprisingly light. He was clearly bearing most of the weight. We shuffled in a clumsy, intimate dance, navigating the turn. His instructions were quiet and precise. "A little to your left. Okay, now back an inch." Perfect. His hand was only a few feet from mine on the same piece of wood, and I was intensely aware of the connection, this solid, tangible thing we held between us. We finally got it to his doorway, and he leaned it carefully against the wall inside. He straightened up, rolling his shoulders and wiping his hands on his jeans. "Thanks," he said, breathing a little heavily. "Really, I'd have been fighting with that thing for another 10 minutes. He finally looked at me, really looked at me, and a small smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, softening the intense, focused lines around his eyes. "I'm Alex, by the way. Leo," I replied, my throat suddenly dry. "Leo," he said my name as if testing the weight of it on his tongue. "Well, Leo, I owe you a beer or something." My brain went into overdrive. A beer. That was a social invitation. A thing normal people did. My carefully constructed solitude was being threatened by a simple offer of alcohol. "Oh, you don't have to," I stammered, already backing away toward my door. "It was nothing." His smile faded slightly, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Disappointment? Or maybe just acceptance? "All right," he said, his tone still friendly. "Well, thanks again." He gave me one last nod before turning back into his apartment, leaving me alone in the hallway with the lingering scent of sawdust and the ghost of a shared effort. I fled back into my apartment, my heart pounding a frantic retreat. I had helped. I had spoken. I had touched the same object. And I had been offered a beer. It was the most human contact I'd had in months, and it terrified me. The offer of a beer hung in the air between our apartments for the next week. Every time I saw him, which I now seemed to do with increasing frequency, I felt a pang of guilt and regret. I should have said yes. Why didn't I say yes? The question echoed in the quiet of my apartment. The answer was simple and shameful. I was afraid. Afraid of the disruption, of the unknown, of what having a beer with a man like Alex might mean. It was easier to observe from a distance, to build him into a character in my own private story, than to deal with the messy, unpredictable reality of him. But Alex didn't seem to hold my awkward rejection against me. His nods became friendlier, often accompanied by that small, transforming smile. He started saying my name when he saw me. Morning, Leo. Evening, Leo. Each time, it was a small, warm stone dropped into the cool, still pond of my solitude, the ripples spreading further than they should. I was becoming hyper-aware of him, of his presence in the building. I could feel the vibration through the floor when he dropped something heavy. I could smell the stain he was using on a project, the sharp, chemical tang seeping under my door. My world, once defined by the four walls of my apartment, was now defined by its proximity to his. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a grand event. It was small, absurd, and deeply embarrassing. I had ordered a new ergonomic chair online, a ridiculously expensive piece of German engineering that promised to align my spine and improve my productivity. It arrived in a box the size of a small refrigerator. After 20 minutes of struggling, I managed to drag it into my living room, where I proceeded to spend the next 2 hours staring at a set of instructions written in what appeared to be a series of cryptic runes. There were screws of 17 different sizes, a baffling Allen key, and a diagram that looked less like a chair and more like a schematic for a lunar lander. Frustration mounted. I was a man who built elegant, intuitive user interfaces from scratch, and I was being defeated by a piece of flat-pack furniture. My carefully controlled environment was in chaos. Styrofoam peanuts littered my pristine floor. Plastic-wrapped components lay scattered like the bones of some strange, metallic beast. Finally, in a fit of pique, I kicked one of the casters, which shot across the floor and skittered under the couch. It was in that moment of defeat, as I was on my hands and knees, peering into the dust-bunny-filled darkness under my sofa, that there was a knock on my door. A firm, solid knock that I knew, with a sinking heart, could only belong to one person. I froze. I could pretend I wasn't home, but he would have heard my pathetic struggle. He had probably heard the entire sorry saga. Cursing, I got to my feet, brushed the dust from my knees, and opened the door. Alex stood there, a slight, amused smile playing on his lips. He was holding a small toolbox. "Sounded like you were wrestling a bear in here," he said, his voice a low, gentle tease. "Everything all right?" My face flushed with heat. I gestured vaguely behind me at the disaster zone that was my living room. "Just a chair," I mumbled, the words feeling inadequate to describe the scale of my failure. He peered over my shoulder, his green eyes taking in the scene. The smile widened into a genuine grin. The mortal enemy of the modern man. Instructions written by a sadist. He lifted the toolbox slightly. "Need an extra pair of hands? I've got about 20 minutes before I have to head out." My pride, what was left of it, screamed at me to say no, to thank him and politely close the door on my shame. But the sight of the chair components, scattered and mocking, was too much. And the offer, the easy, no-pressure way he made it, was impossible to refuse. Yes, I said, the word a quiet surrender. "Please." He stepped inside, and the space of my apartment immediately shrank. His presence was overwhelming. He smelled of pine and something else, something uniquely him, a clean, masculine scent that wasn't from a bottle. He set his toolbox on the floor with a solid thunk and surveyed the wreckage with a professional eye. "Okay," he said, rubbing his hands together. "Let's see the damage." What followed was a masterclass in quiet competence. He scanned the instructions for no more than 10 seconds, let out a small, understanding hum, and then got to work. He moved with an economy of motion that was beautiful to watch. He knew exactly which screw went where, which bracket attached to which plate. My role was reduced to that of a surgeon's assistant, handing him tools and components as he called for them. "Hand me the C-screws." "No, the shorter ones." "Yep. And that hex wrench." We worked in a comfortable, surprisingly easy silence, punctuated only by his quiet requests and the sounds of the chair coming together. I found myself watching his hands. They were large and capable, with clean, short-trimmed nails, but a constellation of small scars and calluses on the palms and knuckles. Hands that knew how to build things, how to fix things. There was a moment when he was tightening a bolt underneath the seat, and our shoulders brushed. The contact was brief, just the press of his warm, solid muscle against mine, but it sent a jolt through my entire system. I pulled back slightly, my breath catching in my throat. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign, his focus entirely on the task at hand. In less than 15 minutes, the chair was fully assembled, standing proudly in the middle of my living room. It looked solid, functional, perfect. "There you go," Alex said, wiping his hands on his jeans again. It seemed to be a habit of his. "All set." "Thank you," I said, my voice filled with genuine gratitude and a touch of awe. Seriously, I was about to set it all on fire and throw it off the balcony. He chuckled, a low, warm sound. "I've been there. The trick is to ignore the instructions and just look at how the pieces fit together. They're usually more logical than the diagrams." He looked around my apartment then, his gaze lingering on the color-coded bookshelf, the minimalist art on the walls, the severe tidiness of it all. I suddenly felt exposed, as if my carefully curated space was revealing all my secrets. My control, my anxiety, my loneliness. His eyes came back to me. They were softer now, the amusement replaced by a quiet curiosity. "You keep your place really neat," he said. It wasn't a compliment or a criticism, just an observation. "I work from home," I explained, as if that explained everything. "It helps me think." He nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "I get that. My place is chaos, but it's a working chaos. Every pile of wood, every tool has its purpose. It's just a different kind of order." He paused, and for a second, I thought he was going to leave. But instead, he asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Do you ever get tired of it?" "Tired of what?" I asked, confused. "The quiet," he said, his voice dropping a little. "The order. Do you ever just want to make a mess?" The question hung in the air between us, charged and heavy. It was far too personal for a conversation between two neighbors over an assembled chair. He was seeing right through me, through the neat, sterile facade to the lonely, messy person hiding underneath. I didn't know how to answer. My throat closed up, and I could only stare at him, my defenses crumbling. I must have looked as panicked as I felt, because his expression softened further. "Sorry," he said, shaking his head slightly as if to clear it. "That was out of line. I should get going." He picked up his toolbox and moved toward the door. "No," I said, the word escaping me in a rush. "It's okay." He paused at the door, his hand on the knob, and looked back at me. The air was thick with unspoken things. The question still lingered. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to say yes, every single day, but the words wouldn't come. "Well," he said, his voice gentle, "if you ever need another bear wrestled, you know where to find me." He gave me one last, lingering look, a look I couldn't decipher but that made my stomach flutter, and then he was gone. I stood in the middle of my living room, next to my perfectly assembled new chair, in my perfectly ordered apartment, and I felt more chaotic and disordered than ever before. He had come into my space, fixed my problem, and then, with a single question, had taken a sledgehammer to the foundations of the life I had so carefully built. "Do you ever just want to make a mess?" The question wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation. And I was terrified to find that a part of me, a part one had kept locked away for a very long time, desperately wanted to accept. The atmosphere in the hallway shifted after the chair incident. The air between our doors felt thinner, the distance shorter. Our brief greetings were now laden with the memory of his question. I would see him, and my mind would scream, "Yes, I want to make a mess." But my mouth would only say, "Hey, Alex." He seemed to be seeking out interactions more often. He'd ask me about my day when we crossed paths by the mailboxes. He commented on the smell of the curry I was cooking one evening, a teasing grin on his face as he sniffed the air dramatically. Each small exchange was a pebble tossed into a deep well, and I was terrified of the sound it would make when it finally hit the bottom. I was on edge, a tightly wound spring of anxiety and a strange, unfamiliar hope. The tipping point came on a Tuesday night in late October. A storm had been threatening all day, the sky a bruised, purple-gray. By evening, the wind was howling, rattling my window frames, and the rain was coming down in solid, driving sheets. The lights flickered once, twice, and then, with a final, apologetic buzz, they died. My apartment was plunged into darkness and a sudden, profound silence, the hum of the refrigerator and the computer gone. The only sounds were the storm raging outside and the frantic, panicked thumping of my own heart. I hated power outages. The loss of control, the enforced helplessness, it was everything my anxious mind railed against. I fumbled for my phone, its screen a blinding beacon in the dark. I was scrolling through my contacts, looking for the building manager's number, when a knock came at my door. It was different from Alex's usual firm rap. This was softer, more hesitant. I navigated the dark, my hands brushing against familiar furniture, and opened the door. Alex stood there, his silhouette framed by the faint emergency light at the end of the hall. He was holding his phone, its screen dark, and a single, unlit candle. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the sound of the wind. "Sorry to bother you. Power's out on my side, too. My phone just died, and I can't find my matches in the dark. You got a light?" It was a simple, logical request, a neighborly request, but in the charged intimacy of the blackout, it felt like something more. "Yeah," I said, my voice hoarse. "Yeah, come in." He stepped inside, and I closed the door, shutting out the rest of the world. It was just us. My heart picked up its pace. The darkness felt absolute, a thick, velvet curtain that heightened every other sense. I could hear the soft sound of his breathing. I could smell the rain on his clothes and the faint, clean scent of his skin. "I have candles," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the small space. "In the kitchen." "Lead the way," he said. His voice was close, closer than I expected. I felt a phantom warmth on my back, as if he were standing right behind me. I am a creature of habit and preparation. I knew exactly where the emergency candles and the lighter were. I moved through the darkness of my own apartment with a confidence that surprised me. I found the candles, thick white pillars, and the long-nosed barbecue lighter. With a click and a hiss, a small flame sprang to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I lit one candle and then turned, the lighter still in my hand. Alex was standing only a few feet away, his face illuminated by the flickering glow. The candlelight softened the hard lines of his face, making his green eyes seem deeper, darker. He was watching me with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. He held up the candle he had brought with him. "Here," I said, my hand shaking slightly as I brought the lighter's flame to his wick. Our fingers brushed as he steadied my hand. His touch was warm and firm, deliberate. He wasn't just steadying my hand, he was holding it. The flame caught, and for a moment, we were frozen there, connected by our hands and the twin flames of our candles. The world shrunk down to this small, flickering circle of light. He didn't let go. His thumb moved, a slow, deliberate stroke across my knuckles. It was a question, a statement. I couldn't breathe. My mind was a roaring torrent of panic and want. "This is happening. Right now?" "Leo," he said, his voice a low whisper. It was not a question. It was a recognition. I finally found my voice, but it was thin and reedy. "Your phone isn't really dead, is it?" A slow smile spread across his face, a devastatingly beautiful thing in the candlelight. "No," he admitted, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a conspiratorial murmur that sent a shiver down my spine. "It's not." The admission hung in the air between us. He had lied to get in. He had manufactured a reason to be here, with me, in the dark. The realization should have scared me, but instead, a wave of something warm and dizzying washed over me. Relief. It was an astonishing, terrifying relief. I wasn't imagining it. The looks, the smiles, the lingering touches, they weren't just products of my lonely, overactive imagination. They were real. "Why?" I whispered, the question barely audible over the storm. He finally released my hand, but only to place his candle on the kitchen counter. He took a step closer, closing the small distance between us. He was so tall, he seemed to block out what little light there was. I had to tilt my head back to look at him. His gaze was direct, unwavering. "Because I was tired of waiting for you to say yes to that beer," he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing that vibrated right through me. Because every time I see you in the hallway, you look like a man holding his breath, and I wanted to see what would happen if you finally let it out. He raised a hand, his movements slow, deliberate, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. His calloused fingers gently touched my cheek, his thumb stroking the line of my jaw. The touch was electric, 1,000 times more potent than the accidental brush of our hands by the mailboxes. This was intentional. This was a claim. "What do you want, Alex?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I want you to stop looking so scared," he murmured, his eyes searching mine. "And I want to know if I'm as crazy as I feel." The subtext was a deafening roar. The loaded interaction had reached its breaking point. He was asking for permission, laying his own vulnerability bare. He was the confident one, the instigator, but in this moment, in the flickering light, I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He was taking a risk, and he needed to know if I would take it with him. My own fear was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. Years of self-enforced solitude, of believing I was unworthy of connection, of being hurt before. It was all there, screaming at me to retreat, to bolt the door, to restore the order. But the warmth of his hand on my face, the intensity in his gaze, the quiet truth of his words, it was a more powerful force. He saw me. He saw the man holding his breath. And he wasn't running away. He was leaning in. So I did the bravest thing I have ever done in my life. I closed my eyes, leaned into his touch, and let out the breath I felt like I'd been holding for years. It was a surrender, a confession without words. I felt his other hand come to rest on my waist, a steady, grounding pressure. He didn't rush. He just held me there for a moment, in the dark, with the storm raging outside, letting the reality of the moment settle over us. When he finally leaned down, it was with an infinite, tender slowness. His lips were a hesitant question against mine. They were soft, warm, and tasted faintly of rain. It wasn't a kiss of passion, not yet. It was a kiss of discovery, a question and an answer all at once. It was the careful, quiet touching of two worlds that had been orbiting each other for weeks. My hands, acting of their own accord, came up to rest on his chest. I could feel the steady, solid beat of his heart under my palm, a rhythm that was as strong and sure as he was. The pressure of his mouth deepened slightly, and a soft sound escaped my throat, a sigh of longing and relief that I hadn't even known was trapped inside me. It was all the encouragement he needed. He wrapped his arms around me, pulling me flush against his body. The kiss changed then. It became deeper, more certain. It was a confirmation. It was the end of the observation and the beginning of the experience. It was messy and real and utterly terrifying, and I never wanted it to stop. The kiss broke, but we didn't move apart. We stayed pressed together in the dark, his forehead resting against mine. Our breath mingled in the small space between us. The candlelight flickered across his face, and I saw an expression there I hadn't seen before. A raw, unguarded vulnerability. "I've wanted to do that," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion, "since the day I saw you standing in your doorway, looking so lost." The confession hit me with the force of a physical blow. All this time, I had been the observer, the one watching from the shadows, cataloging his every move. I had never once considered that he had been watching me, too. The thought was staggering. All my careful analysis, my internal monologues, my fearful overthinking, it had all been a two-way street. I started, but I didn't know what to say. My entire world had been upended in the space of 10 minutes. He pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Just don't run away. Not this time." The plea in his voice was my undoing. All the fear, all the anxiety that had been my constant companions, it all just dissolved. In its place was a feeling so new and overwhelming I couldn't put a name to it. It was more than just desire. It was a profound sense of being seen, of being known. "I'm not running," I whispered, and the words felt like the truest thing I had ever said. He smiled, a real, wide, brilliant smile that lit up the darkness more than any candle could. He laced his fingers with mine, his calloused palm fitting against my own as if it were made to be there. The connection was no longer a piece of wood held between us, but our own skin, our own hands, intertwined. He led me from the kitchen into the living room, where we sat on the couch, our two candles casting a warm, golden glow on the coffee table. We didn't talk for a long time. We just sat there, side by side, his thumb stroking lazy circles on the back of my hand, the storm providing a dramatic soundtrack to the quiet revolution happening inside my apartment. For the first time, the silence wasn't empty. It wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was a shared silence, full and comfortable and brimming with unspoken possibility. He hadn't just come into my apartment. He had come into my life. And I knew, with a certainty that was as terrifying as it was exhilarating, that my carefully controlled environment would never be the same. Just as the comfort of the silence was beginning to feel like a new, permanent state of being, the lights in the apartment flickered once, then burst to life with a sudden, jarring brilliance. The refrigerator hummed back into existence. The digital clock on the oven blinked 12 o'clock, and the mundane reality of my world came rushing back in. We both blinked, momentarily blinded, like creatures of the dark startled by the sun. The moment was broken. The intimate, fire-lit bubble we had been in was popped by the harsh glare of a 60-watt bulb. Alex pulled his hand from mine, the loss of his warmth an immediate, physical ache. He scrubbed a hand over his face, looking around my now brightly lit living room as if seeing it for the first time. The chair he had built for me stood in the corner, a silent testament to our first real interaction. The mess of my aborted attempt at building it was gone, replaced by his competence. Now, a new, emotional mess lay between us, far more complex than scattered screws and cryptic instructions. "Well," he said, his voice sounding rough, a little strained. "Power's back." "Yeah," I said, my own voice a useless croak. The awkwardness was a physical presence in the room, thick and suffocating. What now? What were the rules for this? Was there a chapter in the manual for what to do after a life-altering kiss in a blackout with your neighbor? He stood up, stretching his long limbs. He avoided my eyes. My stomach plummeted. This is it. This is the part where he regrets it. He'll make a polite excuse, go back to his own apartment, and in the morning, we'll go back to awkward nods in the hallway. Except now they'll be burdened with the memory of this. The thought was unbearable. I should probably go," he said, still not looking at me. He moved toward the door, his steps heavy. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the warm haze of the last hour. "Don't run away," he had said. But he was the one leaving. My mouth opened, but no words came out. I just watched him, my heart sinking with every step he took away from me. He reached the door and put his hand on the knob. He paused, his back to me. For a long, agonizing moment, he just stood there. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, he turned around. He finally met my gaze, and the raw uncertainty I saw there mirrored my own. "I'm not good at this, Leo," he said, his voice low and frustrated. "This part." "What part?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. "The morning after part," he said, a wry, self-deprecating twist to his lips. "Even though it's not morning. The part after that." He gestured vaguely between us. "I don't want to mess this up." The relief that flooded through me was so intense it made me dizzy. He wasn't regretting it. He was just as scared and uncertain as I was. Alex, the man who seemed so capable and sure-footed, was fumbling. It was the most endearing, humanizing thing I had ever seen. I stood up and walked toward him, closing the space he had created between us. "You can't mess it up," I said, and I was surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "It's already a mess. A good mess." I echoed his words from before, the invitation he had unknowingly extended when he'd helped me with the chair. A flicker of understanding, of recognition, crossed his face. A small smile touched his lips. "A good mess," he repeated softly, as if trying the words on for size. I reached out and took his hand, lacing my fingers through his. His skin was so warm. "Don't go," I said. It wasn't a plea. It was a simple statement of fact. He looked down at our joined hands, then back up at my face. The uncertainty in his eyes was replaced by a slow, dawning warmth. He squeezed my hand. "Okay," he said. Just one word, but it held a world of promise. "Okay." He didn't stay the night. We talked. We sat on the couch, this time with the lights on, and we talked for hours. He told me about his dream of opening his own custom furniture shop, about the types of wood he loved to work with, the grain, the smell, the feel of it. He talked about his family in a small town upstate, about a younger sister he was close to. He asked me about my work, and for the first time, I talked about it with a passion I usually reserved for the projects themselves. I showed him my portfolio, and he looked at each design with a genuine, focused interest that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't realized I was craving. It was easy, shockingly easy. The conversation flowed without the awkward pauses and second-guessing that usually plagued my social interactions. With him, it felt natural. When he finally did leave, close to 2 in the morning, he walked me to my door as if I were a guest. He paused on the threshold, his expression serious. "I'm not going to pretend I know what this is," he said, his voice quiet. "But I want to find out. If you do, I do," I said, without a moment's hesitation. He leaned in and gave me a soft, chaste kiss on the cheek. "Good," he whispered against my skin. "Get some sleep, Leo." And then he was gone, back to his own apartment across the hall. I locked my door and leaned against it, a dizzy, goofy smile spreading across my face. My apartment was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of anticipation, the silence before the music starts. The next morning, I woke up feeling safe. It was a strange, unfamiliar sensation. For years, my default state had been a low-grade anxiety, a constant vigilance. But that morning, I woke up feeling settled, grounded. I made coffee, the routine motions feeling new and significant. I was halfway through my first cup when there was a knock on the door. My heart gave a little leap. I opened it to find Alex standing there, a sheepish grin on his face. He was holding 2 steaming mugs. "I made too much coffee," he said, an excuse so flimsy it was almost transparent. "Thought you might want some." I took the mug from him. Our fingers brushed. This time, the touch wasn't accidental or tentative. It was familiar. "You made too much coffee," I repeated, my tone dry but my smile giving me away. "A whole pot," he said, his grin widening. "It's a problem I have." He didn't ask to come in, and I didn't invite him. We just stood in our respective doorways, sipping our coffee, the morning light of the hallway illuminating the comfortable space between us. It was a quiet reassurance, a confirmation that the night before had been real and that it wasn't a mistake. He was here. He had brought me coffee. It was a simple, domestic act that spoke volumes more than any grand declaration. "I have to go pick up a lumber order," he said after a few minutes of comfortable silence. "But maybe later? I could use some help unpacking. I'll pay you in pizza." It was another test, a chance for me to retreat back into my shell, to make an excuse about work. But the thought of spending the day in my quiet, orderly apartment by myself suddenly felt unbearable. I wanted the chaos of his unpacked boxes. I wanted the easy company. I wanted more of this feeling. "I like pepperoni," I said. His smile was blinding. "I'll see you later, Leo." That afternoon, I knocked on the door of 4B. When Alex opened it, I saw for the first time the world he inhabited. It was, as he had described it, a working chaos. Stacks of books leaned precariously against walls. Tools were laid out on a drop cloth with surgical precision. And everywhere, there was wood. Planks of it leaning in corners, half-finished projects covered in sheets, the air thick with the rich, clean scent of it. In the center of the room was a stunningly beautiful workbench he had clearly built himself, its surface scarred and stained from use. It was the heart of his home, the altar of his craft. "Welcome to the disaster," he said with a laugh. "I like it," I said, and I meant it. His apartment felt lived in, vital, a stark contrast to my own museum-like space. "It feels real." We spent the afternoon unpacking boxes of kitchen supplies and books. We worked together, falling into an easy rhythm. He would unpack, and I would find places for things. It was a collaboration, a slow, patient merging of his chaos and my love of order. We talked and laughed, and he put on music, a folksy, acoustic sound that filled the space with a warm, mellow energy. At one point, I was putting away a stack of mismatched plates, trying to create some semblance of order in his cabinets. He came up behind me, reaching for a glass on the shelf above my head. His body pressed against my back for a moment, his chest warm and solid. He lingered there for a second longer than necessary, his breath stirring the hair at the nape of my neck. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against my ear. Tight space. He wasn't sorry, and I didn't want him to be. I leaned back into him, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and I felt him still. The air grew thick again, charged with the same energy as the night before. He slowly lowered his arm, his hand coming to rest on my hip. He turned me around to face him, his green eyes dark and serious. "Leo," he said, his voice husky. This time, I was the one who initiated the kiss. I rose on my toes and pressed my lips to his. It was a kiss of certainty, of choice. He responded immediately, his arms wrapping around me, lifting me slightly as he deepened the kiss. It was hungry and searching, a release of all the pent-up tension and longing of the past weeks. We were surrounded by the beautiful, functional chaos of his life, and I had never felt more at home. The pizza arrived, and we ate it sitting on the floor, leaning against the legs of his workbench. We shared stories in between bites, our knees brushing. The initial, frantic urgency of our connection was settling into something calmer, deeper. A comfortable intimacy that felt both brand new and anciently familiar. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shafts of light through the dusty windows, Alex grew quiet. He was staring at a large, canvas-wrapped object leaning against the far wall. "What's that?" I asked, following his gaze. He was quiet for a moment. "It's a painting," he said. "My sister's. She's an artist. She gave it to me as a housewarming gift. Can I see it?" He hesitated, a flicker of that now familiar vulnerability in his eyes. "It's a lot," he said. "I can handle a lot," I replied softly. He stood up and walked over to the canvas. With a deep breath, he pulled away the sheet. My breath caught in my throat. It was a stunning, semi-abstract landscape of a forest at dawn. The colors were vibrant and wild, greens and golds and deep, shadowy blues. But what was most striking was the feeling it evoked. It wasn't a peaceful, serene forest. It was a forest that was achingly alive, full of movement and energy and a kind of wild, untamed beauty. It was chaotic and messy and breathtakingly beautiful. "Wow," I breathed. "Alex, it's incredible." "She calls it the quiet before," he said, his voice low. He was looking at the painting, but I knew he was talking about something else. It's about that moment of potential, before everything changes. When you're standing on the edge of something, and you don't know if you're going to fall or fly. He turned to look at me then, and his eyes held the same wild, beautiful chaos as the painting. "That's how I felt," he said, his voice thick with unspoken emotion. "Before I knocked on your door last night, standing in the hallway, in the dark, I felt like I was standing on the edge of everything." The confession settled deep in my bones. He wasn't just a man who built things with his hands. He was a man who felt things with a profound, poetic depth. He saw the world in textures and colors and moments of quiet potential. I walked over to him, standing beside him in front of the painting. I didn't say anything. I just reached out and took his hand, lacing my fingers through his. We stood there for a long time, in the fading light, looking at a painting about the moment before everything changes, knowing that for us, everything already had. The resolution wasn't a grand, cinematic moment. It was a series of quiet, deliberate choices. It was me leaving my door unlocked when I knew he was home. It was him leaving a cup of coffee outside my door every morning. It was the slow migration of my toothbrush to his bathroom and one of his worn, soft t-shirts into my dresser drawer. Our two separate worlds, 4A and 4B, began to bleed into one another, the border between them becoming porous and indistinct. He never explicitly asked me to stay, and I never explicitly asked if I could. We just were. Some nights we would fall asleep in my meticulously neat bed, his solid warmth a grounding presence in my ordered world. Other nights we would fall asleep on a mattress on the floor of his chaotic, sawdust-scented apartment, surrounded by his projects and his dreams. Both felt like coming home. One Saturday morning, I woke up in his bed to the sound of sanding from the other room. I lay there for a while, listening to the rhythmic, hypnotic sound, a sound that had once been an intrusion and was now the soundtrack to my life. I got up and walked into his workshop. He was bent over a piece of cherry wood, his brow furrowed in concentration, a fine red dust coating his arms. The morning light streamed in through the window, illuminating the particles of dust dancing in the air like tiny, golden insects. He didn't hear me approach. I stood in the doorway and just watched him, this man who had so thoroughly and beautifully dismantled my life of quiet desperation. I thought about the man I was just a few months ago, the man who watched the world through a peephole, who analyzed every nod and gesture, who was terrified of a simple offer of a beer. That man felt like a stranger to me now, a ghost from a past life. Alex looked up then, as if sensing my presence. His face broke into that slow, wonderful smile when he saw me. He switched off the sander, and the sudden silence was full and warm. "Morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Morning," I replied, walking over to him. I reached out and wiped a smudge of sawdust from his cheek with my thumb. He leaned into my touch, his green eyes soft. "What are you making?" I asked. "A bookshelf," he said, running his hand reverently over the smooth, reddish wood. "For you. The one you have is, well, it's very organized. But it has no character." He grinned at me, a teasing glint in his eye. I laughed. "My bookshelf has no character. It's all form and no function," he teased. "A proper bookshelf should be a little messy. It should be strong enough to hold all your stories." I looked from the beautiful, half-finished bookshelf to the man in front of me, his face smudged with dust, his eyes full of a love that was as solid and real as the wood beneath his hands. And I realized that's what he had done for me. He hadn't just built me a bookshelf. He had built me a space to be messy, to be chaotic, to be real. He had given my story a place to land. I didn't need to say anything. He saw it in my eyes. He pulled me to him, his arms wrapping around my waist, and kissed me, a slow, deep, comfortable kiss that tasted of coffee and sawdust, and the promise of 1,000 more mornings just like this one. As I stood there in his arms, in the middle of his beautiful, creative chaos, I finally understood. My life hadn't been peaceful before him. It had been silent. He hadn't brought chaos into my world. He had brought music, and I knew I wanted to listen to it for the rest of my life. I had let a neighbor in to charge his phone, and in doing so, I had plugged my own life back in, letting the full, brilliant, messy current of it finally flow through me. I was no longer holding my breath. I was breathing, deeply, for the very first time.